I'm Dr. Yvonne Cason, the group leader of Toronto Awakenings Sharing Group, and we're delighted to have you here today. Since we started with online presentations with the advent of COVID that everyone knows about, people from all over the world have been joining us for our Toronto Awakenings events. So please take a moment now and just type into the chat where it is you're joining us from today. I am joining you from Toronto, Canada, and our speaker is joining us from Parry Sound. I'd love to hear where other people are from. I know somebody is, there's someone from Sudbury. And I know someone else is in Texas, New Brunswick, Miramichi, New Brunswick. Wonderful. Well, welcome people from wherever it is that you are joining us today. Oh, Seguin, Texas. Wonderful. So it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. So I just want to remind everyone, particularly those people who might not have been here before, everyone is going to be muted during the presentation, except for me and our speaker, Damian Reilly. And if you have any questions as the event goes along, please feel free to write your questions into the chat. And after Damian's presentation, we will have a question and answer period where Damian will answer the questions that you entered into the chat. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Damian Reilly. Damian was born in Edmonton, Alberta. He moved to Ontario and was raised in a few small towns before kindergarten, and then Toronto became his hometown. But now his hometown is Parry Sound, Ontario. He also calls Parry Sound his spiritual home. He attended university in Quebec, then returned to Toronto in the early 90s. Damian had a corporate career and quickly rose to the top and the forefront of marketing leadership, advancing through many blue chip corporations. He traveled the world, he built businesses, but at age 40, Damian's life changed dramatically when he had a near-death experience. So it is my pleasure to introduce Damian Reilly.
Thank you, Yvonne. Welcome, everyone. Appreciate everyone taking a Saturday afternoon to sit here and have a chat, although I guess it's morning in Hawaii. But welcome to everybody to coming in and listening to me prat on about my personal experience. This will be a little bit autobiographical today. I'll weave my personal story into some of the learnings that I've gathered as I've kind of progressed since my near-death experience. And that for me was 14 years ago now. But it was one heck of a wild ride. And that's why this talk today is entitled Identity Crisis Extraordinaire. And I'll just kind of set you up a little bit because I just want to show you here in the screen. This is what I did this morning. I, in preparation for this, headed out into the forest on my snowmobile. And although I did have a near-death experience on a snowmobile, it's that connection to nature that's so powerful. So I just thought, I would draw some parallels ultimately to humanity's identity crisis, because I think we're in one of those right now. If we look at the state of the world and how things have progressed with human population on the planet, and the way we're treating the planet and our relationship with the planet. So we'll weave a little bit of that into today's talk. And I just put the question back to you to see the parallels that you can draw, not only to that identity crisis that I think we're having on maybe a global scale, but let's actually then take that right into the micro level and look inside ourselves and maybe look at your own identity development and crisis as I share some of these learnings and stories that was my personal journey. And I even go way back to, a bit of a crisis that maybe humanity started on when we had oral traditions that taught us. So in my business career, I would have had all kinds of slides set up, and then Ron and I were joking around in preparation for this. And I was like, yeah, I think I'll just go oral this time. And so I'm just going to wing it. This is my first time public speaking in a long time, and this is actually another thing that Yvonne was joking around about, that it's kind of my coming out party. This is the first time that I'm sharing a lot of these personal stories in a public format. So if I do get a little emotional or taken back, that's just the way I roll, and no problem at all on my side. And if I take a little bit of time, then apologies there too. So, but it's a pretty good story, and as much as I want us to, respect those oral traditions, I think that's another inflection point in identity crisis that we might see here today. Is maybe when humanity started to get led astray was as we were actually moving into more of the written word and getting away from what this picture shows, which is, a connection to nature. And there's a kind of crazy balance in this picture when you look at technology in the middle of this beautiful forest. So, snowmobiling for me is my connection to nature in many ways. So, in preparation for today, to respect those oral traditions and some of the teachings that I'll share at the end of the story, that I've been empowered with on my journey. When you shut that motor off and you just sit there in the quiet, it's pretty powerful. And when you're connected to nature like that, I think that's, at least for me, when I feel most at home. So I kind of trace it back to that, that oral tradition becoming more of a written tradition. And somewhere in here, we have to find that balance. And I guess that's called sustainability. And really, that's, I think, the fifth area, the fifth area of identity crisis that we'll probably touch on today, which is looking at our economic system, something that I participated in wholeheartedly for a lot of years, and made a lot of money for a lot of companies, and some of those practices I witnessed have an unsustainability factor to them that perhaps we're not considering strongly enough as we progress, in not just our individual lives, but in humanity's life. So that's kind of like the focus I was going to touch on today. And to set you up and where we are, we're in a biosphere reserve. So that picture is the Georgian Bay biosphere. And there are 4 of those in Ontario and just under 20 in the country. And I think only 800 or 900 in the world. And they're ecologically unique areas that have a unique geographical feature to them, or ecological factor to them. So where we are here on Georgian Bay, we're the largest collection of freshwater islands anywhere in the world. And so we're sitting on top of rock here that is igneous rock, that is the first rock that actually popped out of the planet like 3 billion years ago when the planet was a fireball. And these were the base of mountains that used to be bigger than the Himalayas. And in their most recent sort of reset during the Ice Age, when the Ice Age retracted back and went up north to the Arctic, this area that we're in, a couple hours north of Toronto, Parry Sound, Ontario, became this beautiful collection of freshwater lakes with all these beautiful freshwater islands. So if any of you have ever seen a Group of 7 painting with like a windswept pine, this is where we are. So there's a little bit of a snapshot of the forest. And when I want to ground myself and root myself and really get connected with who I am and end that identity crisis that we sometimes have in those dualities of life, I always come back to the forest like I did this morning. So I just thought I'd share that with you. And also just setting up today. Today is the January full moon. It's the first full moon of the year. There are 28 days in the lunar calendar and 13 full moons throughout the year. So happy New Year to everybody. And we do get to set fresh intentions at this time of the year and set intentions for the year as the full moon comes in. So pretty powerful time. And that also ties back for me in my story to a point that I think a lot of people who are in near-death experience survivors go through, is acceptance of the changes that occur after a near-death experience. So like when I was hurt pretty bad in my accident, I knew I had a near-death experience, but I kind of thought of it in more of a pedestrian way and didn't really understand truly what an actual near-death experience was in a clinically defined sense of near-death experience. A lot of people think, oh yeah, I kind of broke myself up and I got close to death, so I had, a near-death experience. And I've often argued with people that shouldn't we rename these things to be an after-death experience? Because in fairness, most near-death experiences have the commonality of someone reaching a deceased, like your body physically dies, but your spirit stays alive. So, so 4 years ago is where I started to understand all of this. Funny enough, on the January full moon. So maybe this is my coming out party of one, and appropriately so. And I should also recognize that in Canada, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, we are going through a period of reconciliation, and that's really the sixth identity crisis that I'll bring in later on. But the lands that we're sitting on today are Ojibwe lands, and these are also the traditional lands of the Ojibwe people before Canada was Canada. And we actually sit within the Robinson-Huron Treaty area, which was signed in 1850. Canada didn't come about until 1867. And many of those treaties that are all flow all across the country and tie our First Nations and Native peoples together, those treaties were signed with the British government well before Canada was Canada. So in fairness, out of respect to all of our brothers and sisters that are Native peoples in this country, this is Ojibwe land on the Robinson-Huron Treaty. And I'm actually on the traditional lands of Wasauksing First Nation and the traditional land of Wasauksing Village. So yeah, so that's where I am. That's where I'm coming to you from. And I'll kind of get into it and kind of describe my life in the pre-near-death experience. The intro touched on it a little bit. I bounced around from Edmonton to Southern Ontario and landed in Toronto for kindergarten. And I kind of grew up in the West End, and I didn't know what I know now about privilege, but I now understand what privilege is. So I lived that kind of like blessed Canadian life in many ways, growing up in the 70s and 80s in Toronto. And Etobicoke was a great place to grow up. I kind of thought of it this way, at one point, I didn't necessarily believe as I progressed in life in any element of spirituality. I believed more in the fact that, we kind of come out of the dirt and go back to the dirt, and that's life. You live in between those two times. And I didn't see it in any other way at that point. But I look back to those early childhood years, and now that I know what I know, there are obviously some moments in life that you could probably all look back on and say, maybe I was connected in that moment. So like I kind of remember as a kid, like running up the stairs, and when I'd run up the stairs, I'd like do this thing where I swipe my back because I was like, oh yeah, there's something in the basement, and I got to get out of here. And I'd be like up the stairs and get that off my back in case it's trying to grab onto me. So, those are, well, as I've learned now, those are spiritual moments for you. You ever kind of stop and think someone's watching you, those are moments where you're actually connecting with the spirit. So we're not only here, on these lands and in the water and on the earth, but we're all surrounded by spirits at all times and that spiritual energy of our ancestors. So yeah, so I started having some of those experiences as a kid, but I never thought anything of it. You're just a kid and you think you're scared. And every summer I was a little bit of a wild child, so I get shipped off to my uncle's farm. So I kind of had this dual like relationship with living in the city and living in the country, and loved it. I went camping all the time, and I was always outside. I got into motorcycles when I was a teenager and loved motorcycles. And I kind of went to public school and learned all about history as we were taught, and lots about the War of 1812 and the French and the English and Upper Canada, Lower Canada. And I just sort of plotted a course for the Canadian dream, and so that was my path. And I kind of went to university in Quebec, as the introduction said. And there I am at Bishop's University in Quebec, learning away, getting a degree in politics, and having a great experience. It was a very small town in rural Quebec. So it was super fun. But at the same time, I really studied business and I wanted to study people. And I thought maybe one day I'll get into politics. I mean, 18-year-old brain, like, oh, what do I want to be when I grow up? So yeah, so bottom line is I took some business courses, and then I thought, well, half the world is governed, not through government, but through religion. So I took some religion courses, and studied a little bit of Hinduism, studied a little bit of other religions, and started to understand like a little broader focus on things. And I was brought up Catholic, but I kind of rejected that by the time I was like 13 or 14. I was like, I don't think I should be listening to someone who's behaving in a hypocritical manner. And, at that point, I didn't know anything about what residential schools were, some of the things that we're just learning about today. And I think that's a contributor to Canada's identity crisis. And so, bottom line is, I learned about all these as I learned about myself and kind of undid some of these things that I was maybe taught as a teenager and, programmed in university. But I came out of university and came back here to Toronto and this area and just started working and plugged myself into a career, which was like super fun. At Q107, I had I worked for Toronto's rock and roll radio station, and it turns out to be the biggest radio station in the country. And, here I am, a 20-year-old kid, just, driving around doing promotions on the street, and got to do some really like things at the forefront of marketing at the time, which are now actually principles and staples and divisions within the marketing world, called experiential marketing. So we're kind of pioneers in that in many ways. And there's a lot of charities now that give away houses and things as part of their lotteries, and we'll see that in a lot of hospital stuff. Well, we did that at a radio station on a whim and a crazy idea, like way back before that was even entertained. So it was pretty fun. And, I kind of had this attitude towards life where if someone said, hey, do you want to go introduce this band on a stage for us and go do this? I'm like, okay. So, grab the mic. And so I have some public speaking background. I think I spoke in front of the largest crowd with 70,000 people one time, introducing a band, which was one of those kind of highlights in life where I realized why all those rock stars are kind of hooked on sex and drugs, all that, alcohol and all that stuff, because man, there was sure a lot of energy when 70,000 people started feeding back to you when you were speaking through a microphone. And, it was at the Tragically Hip's roadside attraction. And it was Blues Traveler that I was introducing. It's just one of those lifelong memory moments where all that energy of the crowd just came like poof, like it hit you in the face like a big punch, right? And it was so powerful in that moment. And I just remember while everybody was rocking it out on the front of the stage, I was coming down off the ramp in the back and like bounce, bounce, bounce. And I said to myself, I'm a bigger guy, like built like Clydesdale. I was like, I could probably run a marathon right now with all that energy from just 1 minute of introducing the band. So I had like this path now where I started collecting all these kind of once in a lifetime experiences. And so I was living that Canadian dream and I was on that path. And, then I did the typical thing where you get married and, wife and I tried to have kids at the time and there was no luck. And so I started to go through some traumas, and we had 5 miscarriages. And at the same time, I'd also been venting and outletting all my energy because of all the intensities that I had in my life. And, a lot of the things that I got to experience, I realized how lucky I was to experience those things. Like, I literally could go on for hours about my collection of like once in a lifetime experiences, which, in fairness, that day I had my near death experience, like flowed through me like a movie reel. And like it wasn't video per se, but in that moment when I was in the light, all of those memories came back to me. And there was a timelessness in that moment when I was kind of lost in the light, or technically found, where it just kind of rolled through my head, and I was like, wow, wow, wow. So I kind of lived this blessed life. And, a couple things went wrong in my late 30s. And, my relationship sustained some severe damage over the course of those miscarriages and associated pain. And I'd also built this place, we call them cottages if you're not from the Toronto area. Some people call them cabins and stuff, but it's a place on a lake and it's now where I live. And so the introduction said it best. This is my spiritual home. And I'll show you later, because, my left shoulder here has got a nice big piece of metal in it from when my body got rebuilt, from when I died for that moment or however long that was and was brought back. But this place became my spiritual home that day when I had that near death experience. So, this was another dream come true to be able to like build a cabin in the woods, and live on a lake and all that kind of stuff, at least on the weekends. That was my life until I was 40. That was kind of my pre-near-death experience, self. And that's the setup of my near-death experience, because ultimately the near-death experience came from, or setup of my identity crisis from the near-death experience, because ultimately a lot of that had to be undone as I moved forward and accepted the changes that occurred. So, yeah. And one of the first moments where, in hindsight, again, as you might look back on your life and see those moments where you're like, that was a really powerful moment. Like it was when I had that last miscarriage. I wanted to be a dad and I didn't get to be a dad. And the doctor came in and he had said, yeah, sorry, we lost this fetus. And that was the fifth miscarriage in a very short period of time, like less than 18 months. And then I remember this song came on and the music talked to me. And I guess in near-death experiences, some people become clairvoyant, become more opened up. You become more connected to that energy that I felt, literally physically felt on the stage, but still carries with me today in my spirit. And so, that moment, this song talked to me, and the end, it's Bare Naked Ladies song. The end of the song kind of says rebuild, and I'm not a singer, so I won't even try. But they just kept repeating the word rebuild, 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 and I stood there in that moment, and I thought to myself, I felt like I'd lost my wife, which in fairness I did. And I also realized in that moment that I had to rebuild. And so I took that message. And so sometimes music talks to me, and it really talks to me often now after my near-death experience, which was something that freaked me out, because if you go back to who I was, I didn't remember that kind of stuff. I didn't, put value in that kind of stuff. Like I'd sit here having fun with my friends on a Friday night, and we'd be all giggling like you do in your 30s and 20s. And I'd be like, yeah, if I ever saw a ghost and I turned around and that was a ghost, my heart would like blow up like a nuclear bomb was in the center of it in like a billion bits, because I just didn't ever put a value in that. I was like trained to be a participant in an economic system in a way, like a bit of a robot. And so I was kind of good at it. But I think as we live in cities as humanity, we start to become disconnected from where we really come from. And so we turn that off and we lose those connections. And so for me, that near-death experience was, a beautiful awakening. But for a number of years, that wasn't necessarily a positive experience, let's just say. So let's just advance forward now to my moment. And I've learned through some of the teachings that I've been honored to receive by elders, that at a certain point in your life, if you experience a deep, deep trauma, you may actually have a very connected moment where you become more spiritually open, and that allows you to help heal yourself. And that might be a traditional way of explaining what science over here can explain about near-death experiences from the study we've done in science. So for me, here I am. It's January 1st, 2010. It's after lunch. It's a friend of mine. It's just a couple months after that last miscarriage and some other horrible things that I had to experience in my life. And, wasn't, the best time, but I was sure doing well in my career. And, I was leading because I had some senior experience on a snowmobile. I mean, all those years of motorcycling as a teenager in my 20s led to snowmobiles in my late 20s. And so I got pretty good at snowmobiling, and I even worked in that industry a little bit as well through a consulting business I had, and got to some high top levels in the snowmobile industry, not on a riding standpoint myself personally, but I did work with some world champion racing teams and stuff. So I had my team suit on that I actually helped design as the marketing guy. And I was like, with my pal, and there we were on New Year's Day after lunch, like ripping down my lake. And sadly, the conditions that day were cloudy in the sky and kind of snow in the trees and snow on the lake. So it was just like grayscale. And usually the experienced rider will lead and set the path. So before we entered onto the lake. It was my first time on the lake that year. I had already tested all the ice. I was volunteering with our snowmobile club, and I'd been trained in ice, kind of like avalanche training in the mountains. We get ice trained out here when you ride on all these frozen lakes where we are. And so I knew it was okay to go. And we set our plan and determined where we'd go. And the best that we can understand is my pal couldn't see me. And that's why at one point we collided, and he drove into the back of me and tipped the back of my sled, which kind of turned me and tipped me. So as I was turning and tipping, I got ejected off the snowmobile like this to the side. And then I sustained soft tissue injuries below the waist, and I broke over 20 bones above the waist when I collided on the ice and landed on the ice. So there's a couple different types of near-death experiences you can have. Clearly, with the injuries that I had, and Yvonne, can back me up after, that's a medical doctor. But I had a condition called a flail chest. So I broke enough of my ribs that a section of my rib cage, if you draw a circle, essentially is disconnected skeletally. Just the muscles are holding your ribs together. So it depressurizes your lung. I didn't know this until I read my 3-page file 3 months after the accident that I even had a flail chest. And that's apparently fatal in 50% of the people that receive a flail chest. One of those broken ribs had punctured into my lung and ripped my lung open. So I had, pulmonary edema now. So air was escaping up into my neck and up into my organ cavity. And so I was breathing like a panting dog when I was in those few conscious moments where I was awake afterwards, where I was kind of like that. And so after the collision, I kind of woke up and, I kind of said to myself, like, what the F? And I don't know if I was thinking this or not. And I really only have 1 or 2 color memories. So that first color memory, this is like literally the crux here of that identity crisis starting now. And this is the transition point, which was so powerful for me. And literally and figuratively, boom. And I hit the ice. I break those bones above the waist. I cut my liver. I cut my spleen. I had a massive head injury. I broke 3 bones in my face. I had a massive concussion. I had amnesia for a week. For the first 4 or 5 days, every time I woke up, I was like, neat. And I'm like, okay, what about this? What about this? And I asked the same 7 questions over while I was in intensive care. And anyway, so I was very severely hurt. I ripped a lot of soft tissue below my waist as I got ejected off the snowmobile. So I tore ligaments and I sprained ankles. I had nerve damage in my leg. The costochondrils, which are the cartilage joints that connect your ribs to your breastplate and to your spine, those got pretty much all snapped off on the left side of my rib cage. My clavicle was broken, hence the piece of metal that holds it back together. And so, yeah, I was pretty severely hurt, and I could literally just move my arm about like this, and that was it. Otherwise, it was pretty painful. And so, thank God I was in really good shape at that point and had a lot of muscle bulk on me, because if I didn't have that, I'm sure I, would have punctured probably my heart with one of my ribs if I didn't. So there I was now, lying on the ice, and I wake up and I'm like, what the, and then I'm like, Steve, and I'm calling to my friend, and there's no answer, and there's no snowmobiles, and I can literally now think to myself, okay, do your own injury evaluation. And I'm like, wiggle the toes, wiggle the hands, and I'm like, okay, I'm not paralyzed. But I knew holy smokes, I'm not in good shape, and I knew that I couldn't move, no cell service. And bottom line is, I was like, that's it. I got to get rescued. I'm just lying here. And I kind of even got to a point where, excuse me, where I got to a point where I was like, I'm literally bait for the wolves. If the wolves come out right now from the forest, which was my perspective, I'm lying on the ice. All I see is the forest and the snow everywhere. And I'm thinking my boot was crushed into the snowmobile. So I don't have a boot on my foot, and I'm thinking to myself, if a wolf comes, it could just start eating my foot, and I won't even be able to defend myself. And so I did carry a little bit of anxiety afterwards because I was in a helpless state, and I was always, based on my past, like I was always very adept in social situations. So I was, usually the center of the party sometimes, and I could, lead a room if I had to. And I was also a rock for a lot of people in many ways. And some people had always asked, like, hey, how'd you do this? And how'd you do that? And so I was really lucky to have these positive relationships. So in that first moment, I'm like, okay, that's it. Like, I'm going to die here. And I realized that. And I don't know if this is me now, like in a near death experience, or if I'm out of the near death experience. But in that moment, I'll just describe it to you as I remember it. And, I don't know where the transition point was, but more than likely I'm in it. I still think I'm conscious though. And I'm still like, yeah, I had so many amazing relationships. Like, if I'm going to die, and I'm like, all these people in my life and all these incredible opportunities I've had, and, education and like jobs and once in a lifetime experiences, and the ability to, like, I can see the place I built, my spiritual home. I'm like, I can see that. I was lying flat on my back, so I could only like lift my head and look down my body and through my feet, and that's how I can see in the distance. And so literally that was my experience. And rip all the memories. It wasn't like a movie where it was visual, but it was just the feeling of being back in those places and some of those moments I described to you. Like, I was right back there. And it was timeless. Like, and I consider myself to be like someone who can speak well, I guess, because I've done a lot of it. But by the same token, and I've been a marketer, so I've told a lot of stories for companies and organizations and cities and towns and all that stuff. And I can't describe ever where I was in that moment. And it was just like a feeling that kind of embodied me, around me. And then I kind of said, like, okay, I guess this is it. I'm going to die. So, and I'll ask you to do this with me, actually. So we do it together as a group. So now I say to myself, Dave Matthews, artist. Like, I mean, in hindsight, in the moment of death, Dave Matthews pops in my mind, and some lyrics from a song pop in my mind. Funny enough, called "Line Our Graves," the song off the album. Funny enough, Crash, and it says, "When I step into the light, my arms are wide open." And it kind of says, like, essentially, I don't want to be sitting on top of the world wondering about the things I could have been. And I kind of accepted, like, yeah, man, like I'm dying right now, but I live my life to the fullest. So I accepted I was going to die, and I'm like, then I'm dying with a smile. And so I closed my eyes. So if you close your eyes, I'll describe this next part when your eyes are closed, so you can kind of go there with me. So now I'm like, there's a transition, and I know now this is in the near death experience. Now I'm pretty sure before it was as well. I'm in like a big tube of light. Like, I'm not in a tunnel of light. I'm not being drawn down a tunnel of light. I'm in it. And I feel weightless. I feel no gravity. Like, I feel suspended. Like, I'm in a hot tub or something floating, where I'm like so warm and cozy and comfortable. And like, there's no pain. I've got all those injuries. There's none of that. And I'm just kind of like, wow. And then I hear like, and I'm like, what's that? And I realized, holy smokes, that's like the tips of the snowflakes tingling on each other as they're blowing by my ear in the wind. Like, I don't know if like things just slowed down so I could hear that, or suddenly I got like bionic ears, or just because I thought to myself, like, geez, I should have come out here and done this before, because this was really nice hearing the snow blow by me. So I remember that thought. And so I could hear the snow blowing by me, and I could hear that beauty of the breeze. And then I kind of start to, like, in a way, like, leave my body. and I start to see my body from the side. So now I'm like over towards the shoreline, looking back at my body. I can't see snowmobiles or anything else. I just see my body in white. And I'm like, that's my body. And then snap your fingers, boom, I'm at the top of like the pine trees on the shoreline now, looking down at my body. So up from a couple feet, 100 feet, I don't see the full scene. I'm just seeing my body in that suit that I designed on the ice as I knew I was lying there. And I'm looking at my body. And it just felt totally normal. And it didn't, like, if your eyes are still closed, mine aren't. If your eyes are still closed, then it doesn't feel any different than right now with your eyes closed. Like, it still felt like I had a body in me, but I was looking at my body and I was like, and just felt normal. And then that was it. Kind of fade to black. And so now I'll get you to open your eyes in a second with me. But it kind of felt like a nuclear plant, like, had a plug on it and it jumped into my body and bam, I woke up and my eyes opened. So now you open your eyes and I was like, oh, and it was like, I get to live. And then it was like, I was so like excited and it was like one sentence and I was like, this is my second part memory. I'm like, oh my God, I get to live. And it was like, let's fight because I knew I had to save myself. And that was it. That, I guess, was my moment of my near-death experience. So that's where it all started to change. Because for me, between that song and that moment of the miscarriage and this near-death experience, I didn't realize until afterwards when I started to accept some things that that song was part of this whole process. But really, that near-death experience was where, for years, I equated what changed in me. And that was, that spiritually transformative moment. I had a near-death experience, an NDE. I had an out-of-body experience, an OBE, and I had an SDE, which is a spiritually transformative event. So, pretty powerful moment out there on the ice. And the piece I haven't mentioned is that my friend died, which still obviously breaks my heart and always will. And I've honored him since, which I'm very proud of and happy that I've had the chance today. However, there is a second type of near-death experience where someone's spirit can leave their body, and if you're friends with them or close to them and in close proximity to them. There's a doctor that I watched on YouTube who talked about, he's from Hamburg, he was an emergency room physician. He had a friend come into his emergency room one day and surprise him. I think if I'm calling that detail correct, the rest is correct for sure. And he claims that he had a near-death experience, so he didn't have to go through the broken body or crash in a plane like Yvonne did and crawl for her life to an island, swim for her life to an island to be rescued. You can have near-death experience as someone's spirit vacates their body and passes through you. So perhaps that happened to me as well, in the sense that, I was the one who was there to honor my friend in his time of passing. And so, a lot of things immediately changed. Obviously, I was kind of hospitalized and not, doing so great for a few days. But in that moment that I described, in the life, in a way, I became reprogrammed. And that's the start of my identity crisis. And I started to feel the world differently. And the world to me was now about life is planetary. That group collective of humanity sitting on this little planet, floating around our sun. That life gives us all planet. I started to feel that. Like, I didn't need to be taught that. It was in me now, and I knew that. It's in all of us ultimately. Because if you think about it, and I don't want to give away the end, but I'll take you to one part of the end, which is, where do we all come from? And think about that, and I'll come back to that maybe and we'll end that one. And if I forget, ask me. But where do we all come from? That's a great question. And that was what helped me in my identity crisis, to answer that question. And so bottom line is, I started to realize we're all in this together on this little bubble called Earth. And that whole business side of like independent person, successful, yada yada, that concept, of like they call it the North American dream or the American dream per se, where you go make it on your own, and we all publish and look at me in our social media world. It's really about interdependency, and that was kind of what got programmed into me, that concept of interdependency. And people came out to escort my friend to his final resting place while I was, put in the ambulance and taken up to Perry Sound. And then I was intended to be airlifted out to Sunnybrook in Toronto, top trauma center in the country. But because a snowstorm had come in, they couldn't put a chopper up. So with over 20 broken bones, primarily above my waist, I had 3 straps over my rib cage and 1 strap over my shoulder, over my shoulders. And I was head first in the ambulance. I have no memories in Perry Sound. I have only those 2 color memories I described to you on the ice, where I had my near-death experience, and then I kind of woke up, and there's one minor one where someone came to rescue me, but we'll say that for some other time. So bottom line is, I end up in Sunnybrook, and all this is within me. And now all of a sudden, my body starts healing itself. Like my spleen was cut, my liver was damaged, and they started healing themselves. So the doctors were like, don't put him into surgery to fix that shoulder yet, because we don't want to remove the spleen if it's going to heal itself like this. So now I start having one of those experiences, and common in some near-death experiences where there's physical pain and trauma. And now I'm healing myself. My body is healing itself on its own. And the doctors are like, okay, something's, wow. Right. So in my whole physical recovery after this, like within 2 months, like this was January 1st. By March 1st, I'm in the trauma clinic, still in my sling and everything, with my shoulder, all, my ribs, and still hurting. But the doctor's like, oh yeah, like they're looking at my x-rays and all this, and they're like, the team of doctors, because it's a teaching hospital, are all around me. So I get all the new young doctors first, and I know the routine because I've been going through this. And they're like, yeah, when was this accident? 2 years ago? And I'm like, no, it was 2 months ago. And they're like, so I kept shocking, like I didn't realize, but all these medical people, where I could see them being shocked looking back at me, and still do today. Many times, like even in a surgery I had last fall, when I talked to the anesthesiologist, she's like, holy gee, you're lucky to be alive. And, oh my God, you must have a guardian angel. And holy smokes. And, all these stories would come about. And when I actually woke up that first time and I called out to Steve, the next thing I did was I popped off my helmet, and I could kind of gently push it off. And as I got it to the side, my head kind of fell back in the snow. And I do remember like the snow, and I would describe it when people would ask the story, because inevitably when you get hurt this bad, people are like, holy snow, tell me, right? And I'm like, yeah, I'll tell you, sure. So anyways, literally I would say in that moment when my head fell back in the snow, it was as if the snow was the feathers on the wings of angels, just caressing and holding my hand. And that's the only way I could describe it to people appropriately enough. But that's also when I thought I was conscious still, and having those like roles of lifetime memories and people and all that stuff. So yeah, so after the accident, for like a 10-year period, all this stuff started shifting in me. That physical recovery was so powerful. You came back for a reason, messages, and the anxiety, I dealt with that, and that kind of went away pretty quick, and hasn't bugged me since. And but I kind of equate the next decade of my life as like 10 years of coincidences. And then all this, like, that's what I can say it is, like freaky deaky stuff starts happening to me. And I'll give you a couple examples. So like 7 months after, I was lucky to own a place as an investment property, and I was just kind of finishing it off. And I had already started my shift mentally without even knowing it. And I started scaling back from the busy life that I lived to become a little more grounded in my approach to life. And so I was like, yeah, I'm going to sell this investment property. So I'm going to finish off the stuff I wanted to do to it. And so when I had it all done, I walked through it one night and I was like, literally, I think to myself, I guess this is goodbye. And I spin around a room like this one with windows in it. And I spin back there and I come around this way. And I think to myself, I guess this is goodbye. And I take 2 steps and I look down and I'm like, oh, that's a nice little display with the liquor on that little counter I built and everything. And the word goodbye is on like a hard trivet plate below the liquor display. And the word goodbye bounces back at me like milliseconds after I thought goodbye. And I'm like, oh, and it like scared me. I'm like, whoa, that's freaky. But I kept kind of walking. I'm like, oh, jeez. And then I went in the living room where we had a fire going. It was July, and it was an old place, like had been built before the depression. People lived in it through the depression, so it had a long history. And I was only the third owner of it, and so I considered it an honor to be able to transform and renew it back to its original glory in some respects. And so sat there in that moment of beauty, and I sat down. I'm like, hey, this is freaky, but I'm like, when did we get a Ouija board in there? Because that was a Ouija board on the flicker. And I'm like, a Ouija board just said goodbye to me in a freaky way. And my buddy said, gotta swear here because it's reality, but he said, I don't believe in that shit. But before he got to the SH out of his mouth, boom, all the lights turned off in the place, and everybody's like, whoa. And so I'm like, don't worry, it's a solar panel thing. I'll go down. And he said, so I could walk in the dark without needing a flashlight. I knew where all the roots were. Ting, ting, I go down the lake. I look at the lake as I go by, and I'm like, oh man, that's a nice night for the stars. And I'm like, it's so beautiful, right? And I'm like, yeah, the lights, the lights. So I go get the lights, turn on the lights, yay, from inside. And then I come back across the dock, and I'm like, oh yeah, the stars. I go out on the end of the dock. And these things all happen within like less than 5 minutes total time. I go back to the dock, and literally I'm like, oh, and I think this. Like, I did not say this out loud. I think this. I should have come out here before I turned off the lights because it would be way better to see the stars. The lights went out. At which point I'm like, I turned around in fight mode, like the fists are up. I turned around, I dropped in an athletic stance, and I'm like, oh, I'm like, what? Like it was one of those things where I was like, holy smokes, like what's going on here? And that was one of the first moments where those 10 years of coincidence started to happen like that. There was even one, I eventually got into a startup business, and I just wanted to test myself and strip all the corporations away and see how good I was. And so I was like, yeah, so I'm in Vegas and opened and built this little product and wanted to sell it across the world. And so anyways, literally I'm at a trade show and I'm like, boy, I got to sell this product. I'm like, oh, this would be a great partner for me. And then when I'm on the plane, here's a VP from the company that ends up sitting beside me that I wanted to partner with. And I had previously had a little sports car that I sold to someone, and I knew he worked for that company. And so literally I'm talking to this guy, and I'm like, hey, by the way, do you have this car that's, this, and this? And like, at one point in the flight, and the guy got totally scared. He looked at me, he's like, and like, he wanted to kill me or not. I don't know what it was, but freaked him out. I'm like, sorry. I'm like, I didn't mean to say that. Like, I sold a car that I had to someone, and he told me he worked there, and maybe you know him. And I'm like, I forget his name, whatever. Anyways, he's like, oh, I not only know him, yeah, okay, it's all good. He's like, he's sitting 2 seats ahead. And so these kind of things happen. Oh, and I did do business with him, and I did buy a lot of my car. It was great. But bottom line is, like, those are the kind of things where I would think things and then it would happen. Like, literally at the trade show, I'm like, I got to partner with these guys. And then 3 days later, I'm on a plane and have a partnership with them. So 10 years of that kind of stuff started. And I'm still carrying that belief that there are no ghosts. I haven't really accepted a spiritual transformation. So I always did say, though, after that transitional moment, because I considered myself to have been brought up well, that ultimately I was kind of like, best way to say it, like a wise man at 40 years old, and I lived in complete peace. So, that's kind of my near death experience. And then, we've got 15 minutes left, so I'll rip through this pretty quick. But I went through 10 years now that broke into 2 5-year sections, 5 years of studying science. And one of the after effects of near-death experience apparently is you can have memory enhancements. You become like hypersensitive to sugar and drugs and alcohol and different things. And you can have intellectual enhancements. So all of a sudden now I'm like going into the science world. I'm like, I never told anybody about that out of body part where I was looking at my body. But I would tell some people some things, and they're like, "Whoa, that's freaky," and then you'd see them like turn around, like he's nuts, right? So I kind of didn't accept, and that was my identity crisis. Really took a long time, and apparently in some people that have near-death experiences, so if any of you have or went through this, you'll understand in your own identity crisis, but it can take, in some cases, up to 12 years for you to come to peace with your near-death experience. So I was lucky to talk to my first near-death experience, like brother, sister, I guess, someone who's had near-death experience. And so they did say to me, they're like a lead researcher, and they actually published a 5-page list, like a, may not be 5 pages, but 5-page list of all the after effects. When I went through that, I was like, click, 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 click. I'm like, I had 90% of these things. So, I literally started studying science before I got into the spiritual acceptance piece. And I went through like physics. I looked at, is time linear or is time cyclical? I studied Einstein and looked at all his theories and learned about space time and how they're interrelated and how gravity impacts that. And then I went into like the study of physics and energy waves and light waves and all that type of stuff. And then I went into biology and then microbiology. I studied like the periodic table, so I could like pretty much memorize that thing now. I started reading reports from CERN in Switzerland in the Hadron Collider about how energy and matter would interact. And I got into astrophysics and then into like cosmology and the study of the cosmos, not in a spiritual sense, in a scientific sense. I'd go to the science center and talk to like people, like listen to talks, and I read reports and all the scientific reports and sign up for all the, different email alerts from all the different professional organizations. And there I am, like closet hobby scientist trying to figure out what happened, right? So anyways, then I started studying ancient cultures around the world, and I'm making linkages between ancient cultures and modern science, and then linkages between the ancient cultures together, where it's like, hey, their story meshes with their story. Maybe not perfect in every case, but sure found a lot of parallels. And then I started looking into like modern technologies and the development of that, because in my career I always got to work with like engineers, even though I was a marketing guy. So I had to have a technical aptitude. And so that was kind of cool. Like I started like going scientific. I'm like, what happened? What happened? What happened? That was my quest for like a long, long time. And then this is where it kind of took a different turn. Now all of a sudden I'm here at my place and I'm like, hey, there's an owl. And then 2 weeks later, I'm like, there's an owl. And then like in a 6-week period, when I saw an owl 4 times, and I had only ever seen an owl like 4 times in the previous like 20 years, and pretty much never in my life before that, I'm like, that's odd. And then all of a sudden I started having these interactions with animals that were kind of freaky. And like one time a deer even let me, like, it walked up to me, I walked up to it, its mom was over there watching the two of us. I'm petting a deer in the middle of the forest one day. I'm like, this is weird. And so I started having these animal interactions, and primarily birds. Then you start telling that stuff to some of your buddies downtown Toronto in the business world, and then it's like, Riley's lost his marbles there. So, that kind of perpetuated the identity crisis in a way, but it helped me realize like, hey, I got to study like a little bit more here. And so then I started subtly studying Indigenous culture, and I'd had some interactions with Indigenous culture previously in life. So I then, 4 years ago, which is why this is appropriate today, on the full moon in January, I had this epiphany moment where like a light bulb went off, like where I kind of felt like I got downloaded again, like that time on the ice. And then on the February full moon, I literally was sitting in this exact spot at my desk here. And that's where I had my most major epiphany, where it shifted. And I was like, maybe this thing that's a curse, this stuff after this near-death experience. Because again, I just thought a near-death experience was one and done. Like, it happened. Yeah, I got close to death. That was it. Now I'm like, maybe all this stuff is like, there's something to it. And I guess it took a long time to accept that. I had to be punched in the face a few times with it. But bottom line is, I'm like, maybe this curse is actually a gift. And then boom, like I had a Kundalini surge of energy that day. Like I kind of felt like all my hairs, like I saw my hair standing up. I felt like I got charged with energy again. And then when I sat down, I'm literally like taking the Grayson test now. And I'm like, oh my God, the Grayson test on near-death experiences. And I answered conservatively because I still thought it was one and done. So I just answered, yeah, this happened on the ice, this happened on the ice, this happened on the ice. But, oh, well, this happened afterwards, but it only happened on the ice, so only answer it if it happened on the ice. So I went super conservative. and I scored above 20. Like I think I was a 21 on the scale, and I'm pretty sure it said like 7 is like pretty much a near-death experience. If you're 14 because of subjectivity, for sure it's a near-death experience. And I'm like, gee, and I scored 21. I'm like, well, and then I categorized my type of near-death experience, and I realized, whoa, like this was kind of powerful. So then I'm like, I'm reaching out to them. So I'm like, hi, Damian Reilly. I'm like, yeah, and so now all of a sudden I've participated in a couple research studies with them. They help me understand, and I can help them understand. That's what led me to Avon and IANS and the International Association of Near Death Experiencers. That's what actually, literally that same weekend on that February full moon in 2021, I also reached out to. Oh, I can't believe I forgot her name, but I wrote it down. Got myself too excited there. PMH Atwater, and that was my first near-death experiencer that I spoke to, and she's like a leading researcher. She's interviewed like 4,000 people. She's a PhD, studied with Indigenous people, and I'm just like, hey, this is my story. You think it's possible that I had one of these things? I just read about it yesterday. Holy smokes, it's been 10 years, like freaking me out. And what about this? And then she replied back, and one of the lines she said to me, which I did later when I met her on a video chat one time, thank her for this. But she was like, "Good luck learning how to communicate again." And I'm like, "What's she talking about?" I'm like, "I thought I was a pretty good communicator." And so, anyways, now I know. So bottom line is, with all those interactions with animals, I now realize animals are interactions with spirit. So I kind of went through the whole process, and since 2021, I've been studying a lot of Indigenous culture, and I've sought out a lot of Indigenous elders. I even went on a quest where I drove across Canada. I drove all the way up to the Arctic because I wanted to find like an elder, like in an Inuit community that hadn't been touched by anyone. And so I just wanted to get their knowledge and say, hey, what about these owl things? A lot of what I've read says this, but it's an oral tradition. So, I kind of come to the last identity crisis, which really is that that what it means to be Canadian identity crisis, which is the last part of my transformation. And I challenge everybody who's from Canada to open your heart, first of all, to all of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. I don't even like calling them Indigenous because that's a government name used to describe them. They prefer to be called Anishinaabe because they're Ojibwe from the Ojibwe Nation, which is Anishinaabe, or from whatever nation they're from, whether that's Cree or whatever. So I've been so lucky that they helped me explain some of these spiritual things that have happened to me. So now I accept, and that picture I started this with is maybe a good place to end because we're getting close to time here. But, bottom line is, like, where do we all come from? That's really that identity crisis that I think not just me on my quest, but that all of us can ask ourselves. And the answer's in that picture I showed you at the start. It's that forest. We all come from that forest, right? Like what's my body? It's bones and liquid and flesh and tissue and all that science I studied and stuff. We are Mother Earth. And if you can accept that, then you are the dirt of Mother Earth and you are the water of the rivers. It's all Mother Earth. Everyone's mother on this planet, as I realized when I downloaded that day. We're all interconnected. We're all interrelated. We're all interdependent. And we're all together in our life. So there's a beautiful Ojibwe term. This is why the oral tradition is sometimes better than all our big fancy visual stuff. Words are like phrases, and it's not the spelling of the word because it was never written, it was shared in a teaching. And so this Ojibwe word, nikanagana, it means of the same relation. And it doesn't mean that all of us here today sharing this energy together are related. It actually means that all life is related. And so when you accept that you come from that place where we're all related, you can now get to the point where you can find sustainability in how you live your life. And we can get to the point where we can respect each other and step away from the power of the dark sides of us. Because one of the core teachings that helped me in my identity crisis is that, like, this is my human life, and I'll try to do it this way with my hand. This is my human life. It is linear. Like, I was born with my mom, and lived all that stuff I told you about, boom, had my accident, and then boom, and one day I'm going to die up here. But I also have this spiritual side that I didn't know about. That was my identity crisis. So at one point, your spirit and your body become one, and then you move through life together. And then when you die, like I did on the ice, your spirit continues and lives on. And that's how I was able to come out of my body. So in the science, on the forefront of science, we're learning now just about this concept called collective consciousness, which is also defined as quantum consciousness. So how can I share my energy with you? How can people remote view for the military and look at things on the other side of the world and have an impact or energy impact on those? Science is actually just catching up with traditional teachings. So I encourage everybody to really invest in those relationships you have with our Indigenous brothers and sisters in this country and learn about the medicine wheel. The medicine wheel is so powerful. It's really helped me, and that's the medicine wheel. And there's so many teachings tied into the medicine wheel. But at the center of the medicine wheel, my first elder in the Yukon taught me that stands for ME, and it stands for Mother Earth, but it also stands for me. And that's kind of what I felt that day on the ice, I felt that power and kind of felt that today in the forest when I was in the forest. And that was my spiritual transformation. That was my near-death experience. I know we're pretty much out of time, so I'll end it there. But at the end of the day, I hope that helps everybody, on your path. And thank you for listening to mine. And hopefully that answered some of the 6 questions that I raised about identity crises. And there's a little bit of my own. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Damian, for your incredible sharing. Very, very, very fascinating. So if people have questions they'd like to ask Damian, please type them into the chat, and Damian would be happy to answer them for you. I have a couple questions, but we do have one in the chat already from Marina, who says, how were you found after your accident on that day with the whiteout?
Yeah, great question. Hello, by the way. I ultimately I was found through a number of different sources. The first person, my wife at the time, she had run down and onto the ice, and that was the first person that I saw through my legs. And I was screaming, help, 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 but I didn't have the power with my lung, one lung broken down, to be able to speak loudly like I can. So it didn't really come out well. And then I thought to myself, change the message. And I hollered 911 as best I could. And I passed out somewhere in the midst of saying 911. And then I really don't have many memories after that point, because I kind of saw the legs move in the distance. And I thought, okay, good, I'm finally going to be saved here. And so then someone drove by, following my tracks, being the first person on the lake that year to be on the frozen lake. And they're an experienced person up here and know the ice well. So they went out and followed my tracks and then found us at the accident scene. So, one person saw me personally and then, or saw me from a distance and then ran to call 911. But this gentleman stayed with me. And for the next 3 hours while I was on the ice until I could be taken off the ice, he held me in his legs and had my head against his stomach area. So he held me, and then there were over 30 rescuers that made their way out to the ice from the local community, and I was on the ice for about 3 hours until I was taken off the ice. And obviously, it was a massive team of people that came to my rescue and to support my friend in his passing. So very, very thankful for that every minute of every day, actually.
Awesome. Thank you, Damian. We have a whole bunch of more questions. Janice would like to know, what are some of the spiritual gifts you've been given after your near-death experience?
I kind of sum it up this way, is that I kind of would like, when I meet someone, I can feel their energy, like, back to what it was said to me by PMH Atwater when she said, good luck learning how to communicate again. I except we navigate that economic world and the world we live living in cities and that world that we're all trained in, we navigate that from an intellectual perspective, but we somehow, at times we'll turn our feelings off. But our feelings are tied into our somatic system, and our somatic system is what kind of guides us through the natural world of all those energies. So for me, I kind of feel people's energy when I'm near them, and I can form a very quick and fast relationship with people, which I'm really honored about, and I'm really thankful for. I just kind of thought we're all the same, but maybe that is something that might be a gift, I guess, that I might possess. And so I could kind of say it that, I kind of get to see in a way into people's souls and feel their energy. And I kind of see the truth and I speak the truth. There's no sense in mixing words in life at all. Life's short. And life really is the gift here. And that's what I learned that day on the ice. Is that the true gift in life is life. So don't waste a second of it, obviously. And we've all heard this before, but it truly, truly is the gift. So that's why I speak the truth. So I kind of seek the truth. I see the truth, and I speak the truth.
Awesome. All right, that is excellent. I call that becoming an empath or becoming clairsentient, which also happened to me and happens to many people after their near-death experiences. So Marina has another question. Were you able to communicate with any of the animals who were attracted to you? Do you think your energy or aura changed with your near-death experience and that the animals picked up on that? Interesting question.
Perfect. Love it. I'll answer this one quoting some of the teachers that have passed teachings to me. And that first teacher in Yukon, I was very apprehensive to approach him and ask for teachings, being a non-Indigenous person and asking for an Indigenous cultural teaching when that culture has been trod on for 150 years of bad legislation. So, that was a moment where he assured me and he said, we're all the same. So we all have this ability. So we all have the ability to be opened up and connect. So that's kind of probably the best way to say it is through that, is that we're all the same. We all have the gift. You just have to want to tune it in. So you can tune it in. You just have to become aware. And the teachings also tell us that when you have interactions with animals, a spirit isn't going to show up like a ghost over your back because your heart might go up in a million bits. So a lot of those interactions at time that everyone may have, because we're all the same and we all have that ability to access that part of ourselves. The teachings tell us that if you are open, then some of those animals could be your ancestor spirits. So the Indigenous culture's root is that you have 7 generations of spirits around you at all times that you can call on. And those spirits will come guide you and answer the questions that you ask of them. And then it's your responsibility in life to sustain life on the planet by not taking too much. So you basically promote life for the next 7 generations forward. And that's the concept of being sustainable. So you have 7 generations of spirit guides to guide you that come in the form of animal interactions, as the teachings say. And then your responsibility is protect life for the next 7 generations. That's why 7 is an important number in the culture.
Fascinating. Very interesting, Damian. Janice would also like to know, why do you think your body, your liver and spleen healed so miraculously? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, that's an awesome question. I'll tie that back to, one of the guides that I have locally who has also taught me some lessons in this journey of mine. He kind of asked these 4 key questions, and it's part of a bigger teaching, but you got to ask yourself, like, where do I come from? Then you have to ask yourself, who are you? And then you have to ask yourself, where am I going? And then the last piece is, what's my purpose? So I was brought back for a purpose. We all have a purpose. My time wasn't done here. And although my body transcended some physical norms in the way that it healed, that's not unique to me. That can happen to anyone. And that's kind of the power of traditional medicines. And that's the power of what we don't know. Like science can prove for us, this is what we know. But how big is what we don't know? So if you can accept we don't know some things, excuse me, then you can be open to the fact that perhaps some of these traditional teachings actually have some merit. And if you can accept the merit, then that what we don't know part can actually heal you. So I think in a way, that's how I kind of heal. And, for me, I accept what my purpose is now. And I had to go on my own journey to find my purpose so that I could actually invest in that purpose. So, yeah, so I actually give back as much as I can. I volunteered at a local friendship center. There's 130 of those in the country. And I gave back to a local friendship center here in Parry Sound that covers all of the Parry Sound Muskoka area. And I volunteered on the board, and they kept wanting to hire me. So I kind of stepped out and agreed that I would work with them. So I work with them now. So my purpose ultimately is, and it's a similar purpose with a lot of people that have had a near-death experience, is one of those 5 pages of after effects is you become more of a social justice warrior. You become more concerned with other people and their experiences and helping others and helping to, help people have a more positive experience. And that sense of timelessness when I was in the light, that, you kind of lose your executive function in a way, because in that other place I was, time doesn't exist there. It's that, it's a different place. So in a way, you also come back and you don't fear death, because ultimately you've been there and you know that there's no death. So I think the bottom line is we are all given a purpose, and we all should leave this place a little better than we found it. But you have to go on your quest to find out what your purpose is. So I know what my purpose is now. And yeah, it's based here in Parry Sound, and it's helping us create a better community up here.
Awesome. Thank you, Damian. I wanted to ask you if you could expand a little bit on what the Friendship Center is all about, what it's doing, because people may not know what that is. And also, can you tell us a little bit about what your relationship was like with the Indigenous community before you had your near-death experience compared to now, your relationship with the Indigenous community?
Okay, sure. You might have to remind me of that question because there's a couple parts. So yeah, number one, Friendship Center. There are 130 friendship centers in the country. There are 32 in Ontario. Canada's population breaks down into 5% of our 40 million people, ballparks here, have Native roots. That breaks out into 3 groups of people. We have First Nation people, we have Métis people, and we have Inuit people. And that makes up the approximately 2 million people across the country. But about 80% of those people don't live on a traditional territory, which is a First Nation. They live in an urban community within the legal parameters of Ontario or Canada or the town of Parry Sound or wherever, Toronto. So a Friendship Center is a service delivery organization for urban Indigenous peoples so that they can be connected to their culture and to their traditional healing systems. And, many people may know but may not know, so I'll explain that a little bit too. The United Nations declared a human rights emergency in Canada through 2 declarations because of the because of the actual experience of Indigenous peoples. So like one of the highest incarceration rates, one of the highest diabetes rates, one of the highest premature death rates in the country, plus all the trauma, which is now becoming more public around Every Child Matters in residential schools and missing and murdered Indigenous women. Like, so this, I could go on for hours about the statistics. So there's intergenerational trauma as well. So as much as a Friendship Center promotes this beautiful culture that's been hidden for 150 years because legislation said if you practice your culture, we're going to come pluck you out of your family and put you in a residential school. And the family unit was destroyed, which started to decay and destroy the culture. And even some of the cultural items, like this talking stick behind me here, that would have been taken from a community that maybe had a heritage of like 500 years. It would have been used in ceremonies over the course of 500 years, passed on from like, grandfather to grandson or father to son, or community to community. Those items were taken and burned by Indian officers in the public areas of these communities. So those voices were silenced and the culture was taken underground or put into the forest to be protected. So it's time, I think, that that culture be amplified. So a friendship center is a way to share the culture primarily with Indigenous people, but it is accessible and available to non-Indigenous people to learn through the friendship center as well. And it's primarily a healing center as well for people that have been hurt by this stacked intergenerational trauma, where statistically the odds, are very tough in that community for having an upbringing like I had, which is why I started this talk today saying I now know what privilege is. And in some places, that's as simple as turning a tap on and having drinking water. So those are some of the things that I've accepted as maybe my purpose, that I could assist, our Native brothers and sisters to help improve their quality of life. So, and part two, I forgot. Sorry, Mom. That's okay.
All right. I think you answered most of part two. Oh, sorry, I
Okay.
accidentally removed you. That I think you answered most of part two, which was about your relationship now with the Aboriginal community compared to what it was before your near-death experience. So you're clearly much more connected now.
Much more connected, and ultimately connected, on a number of different levels. Again, the honor to have the teachings is the most valuable part of my life now, with what I just described. Clearly, it's something that is not a typical experience, and I recognize that. And so I treat that with the deepest amount of respect that I can, and try to tread gently and respect all of the teachings, even though I will make mistakes with that. But that's kind of number one. And number two, prior to the near-death experience, I always had an interest in Indigenous culture, and I always some of the artwork that I bought in my 20s when I graduated. I was like, oh yeah, now I've graduated from university, I better buy art. So I bought like a painting, thinking I was all sophisticated and grown up, And I was always attracted to that Indigenous art. There was something about the colors and the boldness and that woodland style, that we experience in Ontario anyways. I was always drawn to it. And it was actually an Indigenous framing crew that built the place that I'm in now. And I asked them if they would maybe name this place one day. And so as I had my awakening and accepted this could be a gift, I was able to refocus and look back at those experiences in life, like running up the stairs and wiping that off my back. That's what happens when you smudge. When you smudge, apparently the spirits will attach themselves to your aura. So when you smudge, you're cleansing yourself, you're healing yourself, and you're clearing your aura, and you're letting those bad energies go and asking them to no longer serve you. So, all of these things in my life that I refocus now and I look back, I've always had a relationship and a respect, but it's clearly much more amplified and is very omnipresent in my life, which is part of why I left the city and I live in Perry Sound as well. So.
That's awesome. Thank you, Damian. I think we're going to make this the last question now, which is you mentioned several times some of the very deep teachings that you've learned from the Aboriginal traditions and how important they were in your healing journey. And you mentioned to me about the Macan teaching, about the medicine wheel. Can you share with us what you feel are some of the key teachings that you've learned through that tradition?
Sure. Well, I am enrolled in a program called Feather Carriers. So if anyone wanted to, you could look up Feather Carriers on the internet and learn more about the teachings. John Rice from Wissahickon First Nation and Dr. Ed Connors, who's Haudenosaunee, which is Mohawk. They partnered together and created a program called Feather Carriers. And Feather Carriers is a way of teaching, people these teachings. The Macon's teaching was created by John Rice, and he gives that teaching well. And if you wanted to listen to the teaching from him, you can go through Feather Carriers on the internet, and you'll be able to find that teaching. And I would encourage everyone to learn that, gain that teaching that way through him. But I would say the most important, powerful root of that teaching, which will be explained as you listen to that teaching, is kind of what I mentioned earlier, is that we're all spiritual beings having a shared human experience. We all live as a spirit inside of a body, but our bodies die, and some people look at God and the Catholic teachings of heaven, and the Church of England's teaching of heaven. Some people are Muslim, and some people believe in Hinduism and believe in reincarnation, and your spirit comes back. So if your spirit could go somewhere, then where did it come from? And it probably came from that same place. And so, that teaching will explain that to you. So I encourage you to, seek that out and learn that teaching from him directly, other than from myself. But that's a little glimpse about what you'll learn. And it's really, really powerful, and it'll help you answer those 4 questions.
All right. Thank you, Damian, for a very, very powerful presentation. It was really moving, and thank you for being so open and so vulnerable. And we were glad to be part of your coming out party today.
There you go. There you go.
Thank you.